The UN just issued another directive to African countries. Ibrahim Traoré's response? No. Assimi Goïta's answer? Not happening. Niger's leadership? We'll handle our own affairs, thank you. For the first time in decades, African leaders are systematically refusing United Nations instructions, and the reasons are as simple as they are devastating to international power structures. These leaders have done the math, studied the history, and reached an undeniable conclusion. UN compliance has been Africa's path to perpetual poverty. Here's what's actually happening and why it matters more than any international news outlet will tell you. The fundamental question that drives this continental awakening is deceptively simple yet profound. Why should African nations accept instructions from institutions that have overseen their systematic impoverishment for over 6 decades? The answer is even simpler: they shouldn't, and they're finally smart enough to realize it. The United Nations has presided over Africa's decline since independence. Under UN oversight, Africa went from producing surplus food to importing 85% of its consumption. Under UN-supervised economic programs, Africa became the world's poorest continent despite possessing 60% of global mineral wealth. Under UN peacekeeping missions, conflicts extended for decades rather than months. These leaders have identified 3 core reasons why UN compliance equals national suicide. Every UN economic recommendation to Africa follows the same script: liberalize your markets, privatize your resources, focus on raw material exports, and accept foreign aid to manage the resulting poverty. The results speak for themselves. Mali followed UN economic instructions for decades. Result: 70% of the population remained below the poverty line despite massive gold and uranium reserves. Burkina Faso implemented UN-approved structural adjustment programs. Result: cotton farmers became poorer while international commodities traders became richer. Ibrahim Traoré looked at these numbers and reached a logical conclusion. UN economic instructions are designed to keep Africa poor. When the UN demands he maintain cotton export quotas that enrich French textile companies while Burkinabe farmers struggle to eat, his response is predictable: find new buyers, set new prices, or we'll process cotton ourselves. This isn't rebellion, this is mathematics. Africa loses $88 billion annually through illicit financial flows, supervised by UN-approved economic frameworks. Africa pays more in debt service than it receives in foreign aid, yet the UN insists this system promotes development. These leaders have simply stopped pretending that 2 + 2 = 5. UN peacekeeping missions don't end conflicts, they manage them. Mali's conflict lasted longer under UN supervision than World War II lasted globally. The UN mission in Democratic Republic of Congo has operated for over 2 decades while violence continues and resources flow out of the country. These leaders recognize a simple pattern: UN peacekeeping serves international interests, not African security. When conflicts end quickly, international contractors lose billions in peacekeeping contracts, mining companies lose access to unstable regions with weak governments, and arms dealers lose profitable markets. Assimi Goïta examined Mali's security situation and reached an obvious conclusion: French forces and UN missions had 13 years to solve Mali's problems. Instead, terrorist attacks increased, territory remained unstable, and French uranium companies maintained secure access to mining regions while Malian villages remained unprotected. His solution? Expel foreign forces, build indigenous capacity, and coordinate with neighboring countries facing similar challenges. The Alliance of Sahel States represents the practical application of this logic: Africans defending African territory with African resources under African command structures. The UN's definition of African democracy is simple: hold elections that produce leaders willing to follow UN instructions. Any African leader who prioritizes African interests over international compliance gets labeled a dictator, regardless of popular support. Thomas Sankara was assassinated after refusing World Bank instructions. Muammar Gaddafi was eliminated after proposing African monetary independence. Patrice Lumumba was killed for insisting Congo's resources benefit Congolese people. The pattern is consistent: African leaders who serve African interests don't survive long if they seek UN approval. Current leaders have learned this lesson. When Ibrahim Traoré enjoys massive popular support for expelling French forces and increasing food production, but international media calls him illegitimate, he faces a choice: serve his people or serve international opinion. He's chosen his people. These leaders understand that real democracy means governments that serve their populations, not governments that win international approval while their people suffer. UN-approved elections in Africa consistently produce leaders who implement policies that impoverish their people while enriching foreign corporations. The media narrative surrounding these developments reveals the extent to which information warfare has become a crucial battleground for African sovereignty. When Western media describes leaders like Traoré as military strongmen or coup leaders, they're employing linguistic frameworks designed to delegitimize African agency. The same media outlets that celebrated the Arab Spring as a manifestation of democratic aspirations somehow view African political transitions through the lens of instability and illegitimacy. This double standard is not accidental. It reflects a fundamental inability to conceive of African political evolution as anything other than deviation from prescribed patterns. When thousands of young Burkinabe take to the streets to support their government's decision to expel French forces, Western media portrays this as manipulation rather than genuine popular sentiment. Yet when similar crowds gather in European capitals, they're described as expressions of democratic will. The continental implications of this sovereignty movement extend far beyond individual countries. The African Union, long criticized as a talking shop for ineffective leaders, is beginning to witness substantive debates about the future of continental integration. The proposed African Continental Free Trade Area represents the largest free trade agreement since the establishment of the World Trade Organization, but its success depends fundamentally on African leaders who possess the political will to prioritize continental interests over external pressures. Pan-African cooperation is experiencing a renaissance, but it's taking forms that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. The Alliance of Sahel States, formed by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, represents more than a military cooperation agreement. It's a declaration that African countries can solve African problems without external mediation. These countries are sharing intelligence, coordinating economic policies, and developing joint infrastructure projects that prioritize regional connectivity over export-oriented development models designed by international financial institutions. The resource dimension of African sovereignty involves confronting uncomfortable truths about global economic relationships. When African countries export raw materials and import finished products made from those same materials, they're participating in value chains designed to perpetuate their marginalization. The new generation of African leaders understands that controlling the entire value chain, from extraction to processing to distribution, is not just economically rational, it's a prerequisite for genuine development. Consider the Democratic Republic of Congo, which produces over 60% of the world's cobalt, an essential component in electric vehicle batteries. Yet Congolese workers remain among the world's poorest, while technology companies generate billions in profits from Congolese resources. Leaders like Traoré understand that challenging such arrangements isn't anti-business, it's pro-justice. African resources should primarily benefit African people, and any international partnership that doesn't acknowledge this fundamental principle is inherently exploitative. The security dimension of African sovereignty involves rethinking relationships with international peacekeeping forces that have often served as instruments of stabilization rather than transformation. The United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali, MINUSMA, operated for nearly a decade without achieving its stated objectives. Instead of building Malian capacity for self-defense, it created dependency on external military intervention while failing to address the root causes of instability. When leaders like Assimi Goïta request the withdrawal of such missions, they're not inviting chaos. They're asserting that Africans have both the capacity and responsibility to secure their own territories. The emergence of regional security arrangements, such as the G5 Sahel Joint Force, demonstrates that African countries can coordinate effectively when they're not constrained by external oversight mechanisms designed to maintain the status quo. The technological dimension of this sovereignty movement involves Africa's potential to leapfrog traditional development stages through indigenous innovation and strategic technology partnerships. Countries like Rwanda have demonstrated that African governments can implement cutting-edge digital infrastructure more efficiently than many developed nations. When leaders like Paul Kagame prioritize technological sovereignty alongside political independence, they're demonstrating the multidimensional nature of true self-determination. Educational sovereignty represents another crucial battleground. African universities that were once designed to produce civil servants for colonial administrations must be transformed into centers of indigenous knowledge production and technological innovation. Leaders who understand this connection between intellectual independence and political sovereignty are positioning their countries for long-term transformation rather than short-term stability. The environmental dimension of African sovereignty involves reclaiming control over conservation policies that have often displaced African communities in the name of protecting African wildlife for international tourism. True environmental stewardship must be rooted in African traditional knowledge systems and implemented by African institutions accountable to African communities. Conservation without consideration for human rights is simply another form of colonialism disguised as environmental protection. Cultural sovereignty involves celebrating African civilizations, languages, and knowledge systems that predate European contact by millennia. When leaders like Traoré emphasize the importance of indigenous languages and traditional governance structures, they're not retreating into the past. They're integrating ancestral wisdom with contemporary challenges. The notion that modernity requires abandoning African cultural foundations is one of the most pernicious forms of mental colonization. The generational transfer of power happening across Africa is unprecedented in its scope and significance. Young African leaders who have studied global systems, mastered international languages, and understood the mechanics of global capitalism are now applying this knowledge in service of African interests. This represents the fulfillment of Marcus Garvey's prophecy that Africa would produce leaders who combined international sophistication with unwavering commitment to African liberation. The diaspora dimension of African sovereignty involves reconnecting with the estimated 200 million people of African descent living outside the continent. These communities possess knowledge, resources, and networks that could accelerate African development if properly mobilized. Leaders who understand the strategic importance of diaspora engagement are positioning their countries to benefit from centuries of accumulated expertise and capital formation. Religious and spiritual dimensions of sovereignty involve reclaiming African spirituality from colonial interpretations that portrayed indigenous beliefs as primitive superstitions. The synthesis of traditional African spirituality with universal human values represents a potential source of moral authority that could guide Africa's political and economic transformation. Leaders who understand this connection between spiritual independence and political liberation are tapping into deep sources of cultural power. The linguistic dimension of sovereignty involves promoting African languages as vehicles for scientific research, technological innovation, and international diplomacy. When African leaders conduct official business in indigenous languages, they're not excluding international partners. They're asserting that meaningful partnerships require mutual respect for cultural autonomy. Translation technologies make multilingual diplomacy increasingly feasible, eliminating the excuse that African languages are impractical for international relations. Regional economic integration is accelerating as African leaders recognize that continental markets offer more promising opportunities than export-oriented development models designed by international financial institutions. The African Continental Free Trade Area could create a continental market of 1.3 billion people, with combined GDP approaching $4 trillion. Success depends on leaders who prioritize intra-African trade over traditional North-South economic relationships. Infrastructure development is being reconceptualized as African countries explore South-South partnerships that offer alternatives to traditional development financing mechanisms. China's Belt and Road Initiative, despite its imperfections, demonstrates that infrastructure development can proceed without the conditionalities typically imposed by Western financial institutions. African leaders are learning to navigate these alternatives while maintaining strategic autonomy. The agricultural revolution happening across Africa involves food sovereignty initiatives that prioritize nutrition security over export agriculture. When countries like Burkina Faso increase local food production while reducing dependence on imported staples, they're implementing strategies that strengthen both national security and public health. Agricultural sovereignty provides the foundation for broader forms of economic independence. Monetary sovereignty remains one of the most complex challenges facing African leaders. The creation of alternative payment systems, the exploration of digital currencies, and the gradual reduction of dependence on international reserve currencies represent long-term strategies for achieving economic independence. Leaders who understand monetary policy are positioning their countries to benefit from global financial system transitions rather than being victimized by them. The healthcare sovereignty demonstrated during the COVID-19 pandemic revealed both Africa's vulnerabilities and its potential strengths. Countries that invested in indigenous pharmaceutical production and traditional medicine research performed better than those that relied entirely on international health systems. Medical sovereignty involves combining traditional African healing practices with contemporary medical technologies under African institutional control. Energy sovereignty represents perhaps the greatest opportunity for African transformation. The continent possesses vast renewable energy potential, solar, wind, hydroelectric, and geothermal resources that could power not only African development but global energy transition. Leaders who understand energy policy are positioning their countries to become energy exporters rather than perpetual energy importers. Transportation sovereignty involves developing continental transportation networks that facilitate intra-African trade and communication. The proposed African Continental Free Trade Area depends fundamentally on transportation infrastructure that connects African markets more efficiently than existing systems designed primarily to export African resources to international markets. Information sovereignty involves developing African media institutions, technological platforms, and communication networks that serve African interests rather than amplifying external narratives about Africa. When African leaders invest in indigenous media capacity, they're creating the informational infrastructure necessary for genuine self-determination. Legal sovereignty involves strengthening African judicial institutions and legal frameworks that reflect African values while meeting international standards for human rights protection. The African Court of Human and People's Rights represents an institutional foundation for legal sovereignty that could reduce dependence on external legal interventions. The transformation happening across Africa today represents the fulfillment of liberation movements that began with ancient African civilizations, continued through resistance to colonialism, and now manifests as sophisticated strategies for comprehensive sovereignty. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré are not anomalies. They are the natural evolution of African political consciousness reaching maturity in the 21st century. This movement's success depends not just on governmental leadership, but on the active engagement of African civil society, business communities, and international supporters who understand that African sovereignty benefits global peace and prosperity. When Africa controls its resources, governs itself according to its values, and participates in international relations as an equal partner, the entire world benefits from increased stability, innovation, and prosperity. The old narrative of Africa as a continent requiring external guidance and assistance is crumbling under the weight of empirical evidence and moral clarity. The new narrative recognizes Africa as the birthplace of humanity, the source of crucial global resources, and the home of dynamic societies capable of solving their own problems while contributing to global solutions. Every view, every like, every subscription to channels that amplify these perspectives contributes to the information warfare that accompanies political and economic transformation. When you engage with content that celebrates African sovereignty and wisdom, you're participating in a continental conversation about the future of human civilization. Your engagement helps these messages reach other people who understand that African liberation is not just an African concern, it's a human concern. The algorithm rewards engagement, and engagement amplifies voices that challenge dominant narratives. When you ring that notification bell, you're ensuring that updates about African political developments reach your feed before international media filters these stories through frameworks designed to minimize African agency. Your subscription supports content creators who prioritize African perspectives over international conventional wisdom. Sharing these videos extends the conversation beyond individual consumption to community dialogue. When your friends and family understand the sophistication and strategic thinking behind contemporary African political movements, they become advocates for policies that support genuine partnership rather than paternalistic intervention. Social media sharing transforms individual awareness into collective consciousness. The comment section becomes a space for continental dialogue where Africans and friends of Africa can share perspectives, correct misinformation, and develop shared understanding about the challenges and opportunities facing the continent. Your thoughtful engagement elevates the quality of discourse and demonstrates that African political developments merit serious intellectual consideration. This is more than entertainment. This is education, inspiration, and mobilization. Every metric of engagement sends signals to platforms that African sovereignty content deserves algorithmic amplification. Every subscription builds audiences for voices that prioritize truth over conformity, courage over comfort, and African interests over international approval. The future belongs to those who understand that African liberation benefits everyone committed to justice, equality, and human dignity. Your engagement with content that celebrates African wisdom and agency contributes to global conversations that will shape the next phase of human development. This is your invitation to participate in history. Hit that like button if you believe African people possess the wisdom to govern themselves. Subscribe if you want to stay informed about the continental transformation that will define the 21st century. Ring that notification bell if you understand that information is power, and power shared wisely serves justice. Share this video if you know someone who needs to understand that African sovereignty is not a threat to global stability. It's the foundation for global justice. The revolution is not just political, it's intellectual, moral, and spiritual. Join us.